What would you do if the one moment you had dreamed of your entire life, your only child's wedding, became the moment you were told you didn't belong? Imagine saving for decades, building a future gift with love and sacrifice, only to be erased with three cutting words: stay in your lane. That was the sentence that shattered everything for me. I wasn't just being pushed aside, I was being told I was irrelevant. But instead of begging for a seat at the table, I chose silence. And in that silence, I took back everything I had given, including the wedding fund. What followed was betrayal, a scam, a broken engagement, and a truth that would burn deeper than any humiliation. This is not just a story about weddings. It is about boundaries, dignity, and what happens when people mistake kindness for weakness. Subscribe now to Silent Lies, because the lies we whisper often destroy the loudest dreams. I can still see that afternoon, as if it were etched into glass. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, the kind I had used every Sunday for years, and the spring light was streaming through the windows, making the countertops shine like polished silver. I was moving with the rhythm of habit, steeping tea for exactly 3 minutes, the way I had done since before Andrew was born. Life in those small repetitions can lull you into a kind of certainty, the belief that you know what is coming next. But that day, nothing about my son's words felt predictable. He sat across from me at the table, restless, his thumb darting across his phone, his leg bouncing under the chair. I thought he was just distracted, caught up in whatever young men waste their energy on these days. I had no idea he was about to detonate the quiet air with a sentence that would change everything between us. "Mom," he said, his voice careful, almost rehearsed. "I proposed." Taylor said yes. The tea bag slipped from my spoon and hit the side of the cup. The sound was so small, yet in that moment it felt like thunder. My throat caught, my chest tightened, and then like a dam breaking, joy surged through me. For a second I saw not the man sitting there, but the little boy with crooked front teeth who once begged me to tie his sneakers. He was someone's fiancé now. He was stepping into a new life, one I had always imagined being part of. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to smile without trembling. "That's wonderful, Andrew. I'm so happy for you both." My hands itched to reach across the table, to hold his, to ground myself in the reality that this was truly happening. A wedding. My baby boy was getting married. Memories of my old life, the one I'd shelved after my husband died, began to stir. For 35 years I had been a wedding planner, the woman brides whispered about in Boston's bridal circles, the one who could transform barns into fairy tales and mansions into dreamscapes. I had seen it: alas and silk, chandeliers and wildflowers, joy and tears. I had dedicated my life to crafting moments that lasted forever. And now, after decades of building those memories for others, it was finally our turn. Ideas rushed to the surface before I could stop them. I almost laughed with excitement. "I already have some thoughts," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Not to interfere, of course, it's your day. But I'd love to help. I still have my book of contacts. Florists, seamstresses, venues. It could make things easier." That was when I saw it. A flicker of hesitation in his eyes, like a shadow slipping across his face. He looked away. My heart stumbled. "Actually," he said slowly, "Taylor already has a vision. She follows this planner online modern minimalist stuff. She wants to reach out to her." I blinked. "Oh, I see." My smile tightened. "But maybe I could be part of some decisions? Not all, just a bit?" He shifted uncomfortably, then delivered the words that would haunt me for months. "Taylor thinks it'd be smoother if you stayed in your lane." For a moment I couldn't breathe. The words didn't make sense. Stay in my lane? I repeated them in my head, hoping he would chuckle, that he'd admit it was just a poorly chosen phrase. But he didn't laugh. He just nodded, like a man delivering bad news with no way to soften the blow. I smiled too wide, too false, pretending I hadn't just been dismissed from my own son's future. I excused myself, saying something about a call I needed to take, and went to my room. I didn't cry. I sat in the dark, staring at the fading light outside, trying to understand how the moment I had dreamed of all my life could be so easily stripped from me. That night, lying in silence, I told myself it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe Taylor hadn't meant it that way. Maybe Andrew was trying to avoid conflict. I repeated those excuses until I almost believed them. But in the hollow of my chest, something cracked. I could feel it. The weeks that followed were filled with half-hearted phone calls from Andrew, strained conversations that felt more like obligations than genuine connection. Taylor never called at all. I told myself it was just the busyness of planning, the whirlwind of engagement, but the truth was clear. I was already being erased from the picture. Still, I held on to hope. I accepted an invitation to a lunch Taylor organized, telling myself this was my chance to belong. I wore a peach blouse with gold earrings, light and cheerful. I even brought a folder, nothing pushy, just a few inspiration boards I'd curated. Florals that worked year-round, timeless color palettes, tricks with lighting that could make photographs glow. When I arrived, Taylor barely looked up from her phone. Her friends nodded politely. Her mother gave me a thin smile. I sat quietly, waiting for the right moment. When the conversation turned to wedding themes, I opened my folder and said gently, "I brought a few things. Just some thoughts if you'd like to see." Taylor waved her hand without looking. "That's okay, Margaret. We're going for something more current. Nothing too traditional." The word traditional hung in the air like an insult. Her friends giggled, one of them chiming in about TikTok trends and neon palms. My fingers tightened on the folder. 35 years of experience dismissed with a shrug. I folded the papers, slid them back into my bag and smiled. Her mother leaned over to whisper loud enough for me to hear, "I told you she'd bring something." She probably thought she'd take over. Taylor gave me a sweet smile. "We really appreciate your excitement, Margaret, but I already have a vision." Her words were velvet-coated steel. I nodded, held my posture and said, "Of course, it's your day." Inside, I felt the ground shifting beneath me. I had planned weddings for strangers who had treated me with more respect than the woman about to join my family. That night, I sat in my car for 20 minutes, hands frozen on the steering wheel, listening to the hum of the radio. I wanted to call Andrew to tell him how his fiancée had humiliated me, but I didn't. What would he say? That I was overreacting? That Taylor didn't mean it? No. I swallowed it down, like always. But when I looked in the mirror later, saw the gray in my hair and the strength in my shoulders, I whispered something I had almost forgotten. "You deserve better than this." I didn't know it yet, but that whisper was the beginning of a decision that would change everything. The morning after that lunch, the air felt thin in my house, as if the rooms themselves had learned to hold their breath. I brewed chamomile tea and watched the steam curl into nothing. My phone lay face up on the counter, silent. I told myself that quiet was a sign of busyness, not abandonment. I told myself a great many things because sometimes the hardest person to comfort is the one who knows the truth already. I sent a brief email that afternoon. It was simple, respectful, and precise, the way good planning always is. I listed several local vendors I trusted, people whose work had survived rainstorms, power outages, and those unpredictable moments when human emotion complicates logistics. I ended with, "Only if helpful. Wishing you both a joyful planning process. Love, Mom." I watched the cursor blink for a long second before I hit send. The silence that followed was louder than a slammed door. 3 days later, I drove to Andrew's apartment to drop off a box of his childhood things. There were glossy yearbooks, a scuffed baseball, a few photo albums with fingerprints pressed into the corners from years of turning pages. I thought maybe he would laugh when he saw them, that the memories would soften the edges that had been cutting us both. Taylor opened the door. She smiled, but the smile was rehearsed, like a line delivered in a play that had been running too long. "Oh, hey. We did not know you were coming," she said, still standing in the doorway as though the threshold were a border to be guarded. "I brought a few keepsakes," I said, lifting the box. "Perhaps they could be useful for displays or the slideshow." She tilted her head. "We are doing something digital. Super casual. Phones. You know." Andrew appeared behind her then, weary around the eyes. He hugged me quickly. The kind of hug you give someone while you are already thinking about leaving. "You could have left the box downstairs," he said gently. "You did not need to come all the way up." "I was in the neighborhood," I lied. "I was not. I had driven across the city because sometimes mothers still show up even when they are no longer invited to." Taylor cleared her throat. "We are about to head to a venue appointment." "You found a place?" I asked. "How wonderful." "A rooftop downtown," she said brightly. "Chic, not stuffy, very us." "It sounds lovely," I managed. "Did you consider the Elmwood estate?" "I know the owners. They do remarkable outdoor ceremonies." Her smile tightened. "It is a bit dated. We want to avoid anything that feels too, mom and dad wedding." I laughed as if I agreed. They closed the door before I reached the elevator. That night, I pulled my old planning binders from the shelf. The leather was cracked at the edges, the paper softened by use. They smelled faintly of flowers and ink, and a life I had lived with my whole self. I sat at the table and turned pages as if the past could hum me to sleep. In the spaces between swatches and timelines, I heard something like anger forming, not hot and loud, but cold and clean. It was the kind of anger that says, "This is a line, do not cross it." I invited them to dinner. I roasted pot roast because it had been Andrew's favorite since he was 8, and I set the table with linen napkins and proper candles, the way you do when you mean this to be an offering. They arrived 30 minutes late. Taylor wrinkled her nose and said the smell was intense. She said she did not really eat red meat. I poured tea and asked about planning. She offered small answers that were not answers at all. When I gently mentioned a seamstress who still cut gowns by hand, she set her cup down too hard. "Margaret," she said, and she wore my name like jewelry she had no intention of keeping. "I know you mean well, but I do not think you are hearing us. We are doing things differently. It is not the 90s. I have an amazing planner lined up." Andrew stayed quiet, a silence that hurt more than any sharp word. I breathed in. I breathed out. "I hope it is everything you want," I said. And I meant it. Want can be a dangerous flame. It burns through caution faster than you expect. Taylor smiled, gentle as glass. "It will be. I just need everyone to stay in their lane so it all goes smoothly." There it was again, the phrase that turned my love into a liability. Stay in your lane. I cleared the plates, packed them leftovers, and kissed my son goodbye. When the latch clicked, the room throbbed with quiet. I stood at the empty table and let the truth crystallize. I was not part of this. Not really. And because I had been asked to stay in my lane, I understood finally what I needed to do: obey. The next morning the air was cold and honest. I opened the small wooden box I had kept hidden at the back of my bedroom closet. Inside were account statements and a notebook with my husband's handwriting. For Andrew's day he had written, "Make it count." 20 years of saving, of saying no to vacations and new furniture, and the dull comforts that money buys. 20 years of love translated into numbers. I ran my fingers along the ink until it felt like prayer. At the bank, the teller had a soft pink manicure and the practiced smile of someone who handles other people's decisions for a living. I asked to modify an account, a withdrawal, a partial transfer. She clicked her keyboard, nodded, and slid papers across the counter. To her, it was routine. To me, it was a boundary that had finally learned to speak. I left a small amount in the original fund, a token to keep up appearances. The rest moved to a private account under my name. I did not announce it. I did not apologize. I simply placed my hands back on my own steering wheel. That evening, I wrote a note and tucked a modest check inside. "Dear Andrew and Taylor," I wrote, "as you prepare for your big day, I wanted to offer a small contribution. I trust that you will make it meaningful in your own way. Wishing you joy always. With love, Mom." The envelope went into the mailbox the next morning with a soft, decisive thud. A week later, Andrew knocked on my door. He looked like a man carrying 2 heavy bags that had his name on them, whether he wanted them or not. We sat in the living room. I offered tea. He declined. "Taylor saw the check," he said. She was surprised. "I imagined she would be," I said evenly. She thought, we both thought, you were planning to cover more, the full amount. "I know," I said. "I changed my mind." "Why?" "Because I was not invited to be part of anything," I answered. "Not the venue, not the decisions, not the vision. I was asked to stay in my lane. I did." He rubbed the back of his neck. "It is not like that. Taylor just wants control. She gets overwhelmed." "Overwhelmed is not an excuse for disrespect," I said softly. "Perfect does not require erasing people." He stared at the floor. "So that is it? You are not going to help at all?" "I did help," I said, "in the way I was invited to." He stood, frustrated by the reality he could not rearrange. "Taylor is going to freak out." I did not soothe him. I had spent years soothing everyone but myself. After he left, I did not cry. That surprised me. I realized I was not mourning money. I was mourning a moment that never came, the one where I was allowed to be the mother of the groom without asking permission to exist. 2 days later he called again, his voice tight and dull. "She signed a contract," he said. "A planner from social media. She is huge. Savannah Bloom." My stomach tightened. I had seen the rise of aesthetic over substance. I had watched it eat budgets alive. "How much?" He hesitated, then said 55,000. I braced my hands on the counter to steady the room. "Is she licensed? Does she have a registered business? An address? References?" "Taylor handled that," he said. Of course she had. I closed my eyes and saw the future sprinting ahead, faster than due diligence could catch it. It was no longer my job to chase. That night, for the first time in months, I slept through without waking. The decision had settled inside me like a stone that sinks and stays. In the morning, I opened my back door and let cold air move through the house. It smelled like winter coming and something else too. It smelled like space. Days later, the phone rang while I was pruning the roses. "She is gone," Andrew said. "The planner, website down, numbers disconnected. The Instagram is wiped. We have been scammed." He asked what to do. He asked what Taylor said. He asked 100 questions that could not change the past. I answered the only one that mattered. "Begin again," I said. "Begin differently." The wind shifted through the garden, and the roses trembled. I let the shears hang at my side and felt the weight I had been carrying finally step off my chest. Staying in my lane had felt like surrender at first. Now, it felt like survival. I had not abandoned my son. I had refused to fund my own erasure. The days after the call felt like walking through a house after a storm. Everything was still standing, but nothing was where it used to be. I moved slowly, making coffee, watering plants, folding laundry that did not need folding. The quiet did not comfort me. It pressed in from the corners, reminding me that I had been right and that being right could feel as empty as an abandoned church. Andrew sent no messages. Taylor sent none. The world proceeded with its usual noise while our small world lay dismantled, piece by piece, by a planner with a beautiful feed and a vanishing act. I learned details the way one learns about a distant fire, through smoke that drifts into your lungs before you see the flames. A florist I knew mentioned that a vendor downtown had heard about a rash of cancellations. A mutual acquaintance said the rooftop venue had released their date. I did not ask for confirmation. I had seen enough to know the shape of the truth. They had built their plans on air, and air had disappeared. When Andrew finally called again, his voice sounded like it had been left out in the rain. He described a week of frantic emails, of credit card holds and dispute claims and messages sent into the void. He said Taylor was furious. He said she had spoken with her mother, and that her mother had said some things that I will not write down, because certain words have a way of souring the mouth if you repeat them. He asked what I would do if it were my event. I told him the truth. I would stop. I would start over. Not the planning, not the party, but the thinking. The story had to change before the details could. For a while I did not hear much. Silence can be a weapon, but it can also be a cast that lets the bones knit. I took long walks. I read books that did not mention weddings. I called friends and turned down invitations. The rooms of my home began to feel like rooms again instead of waiting areas. I cooked simple meals and ate them slowly. Every now and then the phone would vibrate with a notification, and some old habit would sprint to the surface. But it was never Andrew. It was never Taylor. Then, one gray afternoon, I opened my laptop and saw her face on a local news site, bleached and polished under studio light, the headline stark as a slap. A social media wedding planner had vanished with client deposits totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. The reporter spoke in a careful tone that tried to thread compassion with spectacle. They showed stills from an account that no longer existed, the kind of content that sells dreams like candy. The words scrolled below with the names of cities and law enforcement agencies. There was a brief mention of my son and Taylor as local victims. The word tasted wrong. Victim is a word for someone who had no part in the harm. The harm here had two parents, a fraud and an ego. I did not cheer. I did not pour a drink or text anyone that I had called it. There is no victory in being correct about a lesson that drags the people you love through mud. I turned off the laptop and sat at the table with my hands folded, listening to the refrigerator hum. I had spent years building nights like that for other people, evenings where candles flickered and speeches made eyes shine. Now I sat in a kitchen with a quiet appliance and thought about what it means for a person to learn the difference between wanting and needing. Wanting is bright. Needing is steady. Weddings should be built on steady. They had built theirs on bright. News traveled the way it always does in neighborhoods. A woman from the library mentioned she had seen Taylor at the market with her mother. Someone else said the engagement was on pause, which is the polite way to say that the engine has seized. I listened with the measured distance of someone who has finally decided to stop bleeding from other people's wounds. I felt no thrill. I felt no smugness. I felt the clean, almost medicinal calm that comes when a fever breaks. I had no more battles to fight. The ground had done the work for me. Weeks slipped forward. The trees outside my kitchen began to turn, green surrendering to gold. I took a ceramics class at the community center. My first bowl came out lopsided. A shy little thing that wobbled when you put it down. I kept it anyway. It made me laugh, and laughter is a kind of proof that life is still moving. I volunteered at the library for the children's hour, arranging chairs in tiny rings and picking up crayons from under tables. I stood in line at the bakery behind a father and his little girl while she chose a frosting color, and he pretended the decision was a matter of national security. The smallness of those moments felt like a cure for something I had not known how to name. Every so often I would pass the shelf with the old planning binders. They looked less like relics now, and more like tools in a workshop I might return to someday. I did not reach for them. Not yet. I wanted to be sure that if my hands touched those pages again, it would be because my heart had asked, not because my fear had begged. One rainy morning I saw my friend Diane from the library by the grocery store entrance, both of us with our bags clutched to our coats. She tilted her head in that way that people do when they are about to deliver news framed as concern. She said Taylor had moved back with her mother. She said people were saying the two of them had been fighting even before the planner vanished, that the money had only pushed a door that was already cracked. I nodded. I did not pretend to know their private storms. I just knew that when a story is built around control and image, it will not survive the first hard wind. That night I sat in my living room without turning on the lamp. The evening dark gathered in the corners, and for once I let it. I had been performing light for so long, making brightness for others, that I had forgotten darkness can be honest. In the quiet I looked at the outline of the fireplace and the soft shapes of the furniture, and thought about all the versions of myself I had played, trying to keep peace. The fixer, the forgiver, the woman who was invited to give but not to exist. I had laid those roles down one by one, and there, in the gentle dark, I felt lighter than I had in years. An older woman in the ceramics class asked me where I had worked. When I told her, she laughed softly and said her daughter could use someone like me. I smiled and said perhaps another time. You cannot rush the return to what hurt you. You must build it new or do not build it at all. I began to understand that my love for planning was not about flowers or linens. It was about meaning. It was about helping people speak the truth with a ceremony instead of a speech. One afternoon, while walking home past the little park at the end of my street, I saw a child trying to fly a kite in a stubborn wind. The kite kept rising and collapsing, until the father stepped behind her and placed his hands over hers. The next try caught, the sky held the string like a held breath, and the child squealed. I stood there for a moment, rain prickling my cheeks, and thought about my son. Love, when it is real, does not grab the string. It steadies the hands that are trying. I had tried to steady his hands, and when I had been pushed aside, I had stepped away. The stepping away had been a steadiness too, but of a different kind. That evening I slept with the window cracked, letting the cold air move across the room. I dreamed of nothing, no vows, no checks, no disappearing websites. I woke before dawn to a house that felt neither haunted nor expectant. It felt like a place where a life could continue. I made tea and stood by the window, watching the streetlights blink out one by one as the morning undid the night. There is a rhythm in that surrender that is more honest than celebration. Night does not fight the dawn. It yields. I had yielded, not to defeat, but to dignity. When the phone finally rang again, it was Andrew. The sound of his voice had changed. There was less polish, less paper over the cracks. He did not talk about contracts or photographers or opinions. He talked about work. He talked about sleep that would not come. He talked about how quiet an apartment can feel when a future has walked out the door with all the framed plans. He did not ask for money. He did not make excuses. He said he was sorry. He did not add a reason or a plea. Just the word. It was enough. After we hung up, I stood in the kitchen and let the kettle steam without rushing to silence it. The air filled with warmth and something like forgiveness. I had set a boundary. It had cost me time, tears I never cried, and the soft ache of being misunderstood by the person I loved most. But boundaries are not walls. They are doors you close so that you can hear the knock when someone chooses to come back with respect. Outside, the sky cleared into a washed blue, the kind that makes you feel as if you have been given a spare day to do with as you please. I cleaned the counters. I watered the fern by the sink. I looked at the binders again and placed a hand on the spine of the top one. Not yet, I told myself. But soon. The story had paused. It had not ended. And on the other side of that pause, something was waiting that did not need spectacle to feel like grace. The news spread quickly. carried on whispers that felt like smoke seeping under doors. Andrew and Taylor's wedding was no longer postponed. It was over. At first I thought the collapse would devastate me, that I would feel grief claw at my chest, the way it had the night I lost my husband. But what came instead was something colder, clearer, and more enduring. It was the calm of someone who had finally stopped waiting for validation. I had not destroyed their dream. They had destroyed it themselves by refusing to see truth when it stood right in front of them. I heard from acquaintances that Taylor had moved back into her mother's home. Andrew stayed in the apartment alone. People speculated about blame, about shouting matches and slammed doors. I did not ask for details. Details have a way of turning pain into theater, and I had no appetite for performance anymore. What mattered was that the curtain had dropped on a play I had never been allowed to join. One late afternoon, while the autumn sky bruised purple over the rooftops, I took a walk through the quiet streets. The air smelled of damp leaves and distant fireplaces. Couples passed me on the sidewalk, arms linked, voices low. For the first time in months, their laughter did not wound me. It reminded me that life continues, that not every story ends in bitterness. Mine did not have to. In the weeks that followed, I began to live differently. I joined a writing group at the community center, where retirees read their memories aloud in shaky but determined voices. I went to brunch with old friends who asked nothing from me except presence. I repainted my hallway in a soft sage green, the kind of color that makes you feel as if you are breathing inside a garden. Every brushstroke felt like a reclaiming of space, a declaration that my life was not a waiting room for other people's choices. But healing is never linear. Some nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing Taylor's voice echo, "Stay in your lane." The phrase had once felt like exile. Now it began to feel like instruction. I had stayed in my lane, and by doing so, I had protected myself from being erased. Boundaries, I realized, are not prisons. They are shields. One evening at the grocery store, I ran into a neighbor named Marlene, who was always eager to share what she knew. She leaned close as the rain drummed on the roof above us and said, "Did you hear?" Taylor and Andrew called it off. She spoke as if delivering scandal, but to me it was confirmation, a truth already settled inside my bones. I smiled politely, thanked her, and walked out into the drizzle. In the car I sat with my hands resting on the wheel, the windshield blurred by water. It was not joy I felt. It was not relief either. It was clarity. When something is built on control, vanity, and exclusion, it does not survive the first storm. That was not tragedy. That was inevitability. Time passed. The world shifted. The fraudulent planner, Savannah Bloom, was finally exposed in full. National outlets reported that she had scammed couples across the country, siphoning dreams into her own pockets. I watched a news segment at my kitchen table. Her face flashed on the screen, flawless in filters, empty in substance. Behind her image, the words, "Social media wedding planner vanishes with hundreds of thousands of dollars." Victims wept on camera. A father who had mortgaged his home. A couple who had canceled their honeymoon. Then came Andrew and Taylor's names, a mere line in a growing list of casualties. The anchor's voice tried to balance pity with judgment, but all I heard was the sound of lessons arriving too late. I did not gloat. I did not whisper "I told you so" into the empty kitchen, because this was not triumph. This was wreckage, and wreckage does not need applause. I began to notice something subtle then. As the world finally caught up to what I had already known, I felt lighter. The weight of trying to be heard had vanished. I no longer needed to explain, to argue, to prove my worth. Silence had done the work for me. I had chosen dignity over drama, and dignity had delivered me to peace. Still, I wondered about Andrew. Nights came when I imagined him alone in that apartment, surrounded by echoes of promises that had dissolved. I wondered if he thought of me, if he replayed the moments when he had stood silent while I was diminished. I did not call him. I did not press. Love cannot be forced into recognition. It must return of its own will, or it is not love at all. And then, one evening, he appeared. I saw him first, through the living room window, standing at the gate like a boy who had walked too far in the dark. His shoulders sagged, his hands jammed into his pockets. When I opened the door, the single word he spoke cracked something inside me. "Mom." It was not a plea, it was not an excuse, it was acknowledgement. I stepped aside, let him in, and asked if he was hungry. He nodded. At the table we ate simple food, nothing special. But the silence between us felt less like distance and more like ground waiting to be crossed. He spoke about work, about a book he had been reading, about nights too quiet for sleep. He did not mention Taylor until the end. "She is gone," he said softly, "and I think maybe it is for the best." I did not answer right away. I poured him tea, watched the steam rise, and placed the cup before him. My silence told him what he needed to know, that there was no gloating here, only space for him to arrive at his own truth. Later that night, after he left, I sat at the kitchen table with a blank notebook. For the first time in years, I wrote a new name at the top of a fresh page. Emily. A woman he had just begun to see. Someone who, he told me, was kind and gentle and had asked about me before asking about anything else. She wanted to meet me, he said, not because of weddings or appearances, but because she wanted to know the woman who had raised him. I closed the notebook and placed my hand on its cover. For the first time in a long time, I felt something new blooming inside me. Not hope that someone else would see my worth, but certainty that I no longer needed permission to stand in my own light. He came to the gate again a week later, but this time there was a softness in his face that I had not seen since he was a boy. He did not fidget. He did not stare at the ground. He looked at me as if a door had been opened and a draft of real air had finally reached him. We ate at the table like before, simple food, slow sips of tea. He spoke about a woman named Emily with a gentleness that made the room feel warmer. She was not a headline or a performance. She was steady. She was curious. She listened. He said she asked about me the second time they met. Not about the scandal, not about the vanished planner, not about the check that had sent a ripple through our family. She asked about the woman who raised him, about what I loved, about the way I made decisions. He told me that he had described my old work without apology, that he had used the word art when he spoke about how I built ceremonies. I watched his hands as he talked. They were not defensive. They were not pleading. They were simply telling the truth. When we finished, he pulled a photograph from his pocket. Emily stood in a garden, laughing at something outside the frame, her hands full of wildflowers. Light skimmed her hair. Nothing about the image was curated. It looked like a moment that had happened because no one was trying to make it happen. He said she wanted to meet me, that she was nervous, that she hoped I would not judge her for being ordinary. I felt something in my chest ease. Ordinary is where love lives when it is done performing. We met at a small coffee shop with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that changed with the weather. Emily arrived with wind-pinked cheeks and an apology for being 2 minutes late. She extended her hand and then laughed at herself and said she was a hugger, if that was all right. It was. Her hug was not a claim. It was a welcome. We sat by the window. She asked me about the first wedding I ever planned, about the worst rainstorm I ever outmaneuvered, about the moment when a ceremony no longer feels like logistics but crosses the line into meaning. No one had asked me questions like that in a long time. I told her a story about a bride whose veil had snagged on a splintered pew at the exact second the music began. I told Emily how the groom had reached back without turning and freed the lace with a touch so tender the entire room exhaled. That, I said, is what a wedding is supposed to be, not spectacle. A gesture that reveals who you already are. Emily listened as if I were telling her a secret that might save something. Then she took a breath and surprised me. "If we ever marry," she said, "I would want you to help. Not because you are his mother, because you are the person who sees the ceremony for what it is." I did not promise anything in that moment. I wanted to be sure I was not stepping back into a room that would demand my voice and then punish me for using it. But when I walked home afterward, I felt the quiet thrum of a yes forming, a yes that belonged to me. Weeks unfolded with the simple patience of early spring. Emily came by on Saturdays with coffee and a notebook that had more blank pages than plans. We did not begin with colors or flowers, we began with feelings. She said she wanted the day to feel like honesty, like a hand steadying another hand, like laughter that did not need to be loud to be real. I wrote the words in a new notebook, careful letters, ample space between lines, joy, gratitude, gentleness. These were not decor, these were scaffolding. Andrew joined us when he could. He had learned to listen to silence, to let pauses do their quiet work. He did not rush Emily. He did not rush me. He asked practical questions, the kind that honor budgets and time. He laughed more easily now. Sometimes he looked at me when Emily was not watching, an apology flickering into a gratitude that stayed. I did not need the apology anymore. The gratitude was enough. We visited spaces that could hold the kind of promise they imagined. No rooftops with branded lighting. No ballrooms that swallowed voices, We stood in a garden behind a small museum where a row of old trees curved their branches into a natural arch. The ground smelled like earth. A fountain murmured in a corner. A caretaker named Alma told us the place bloomed in stages, so something would be in flower no matter the week. Emily touched my elbow and whispered, "This feels like us." I believed her. I called a florist who still woke at 4 to meet the markets and ran her business from a narrow shop that looked like a poem. She did not have 1 million followers. She had hands that had learned the language of stems. I asked for arrangements that looked gathered, not engineered. She smiled and told me she had been waiting years for someone to ask for that again. We chose wild greens and small flowers that looked like lights left on in a forest. When Emily saw the sample, her mouth opened the way mouths open when a person recognizes themselves. No gasp, just recognition. We settled on a seamstress who cut fabric as if she were sharpening a sentence. A woman whose window displayed nothing because everything she made was for a body, not a mannequin. Emily did not want tulle that dragged like a net. She wanted to move, to breathe, to hold the people she loved without being swallowed by her dress. The seamstress listened and sketched, and said yes in a way that made yes feel like a vow. There were moments when the old ache tried to return. A song would play in a cafe, and I would remember a night at my table with candles and silence and a sentence that turned love into limits. I let the ache come. I let it teach me what it needed to teach, and then I let it go. Boundaries are not fences around the heart. They are the rules by which a heart stays strong enough to open again. On a pale afternoon, Andrew brought over a box I recognized. The same box of childhood things I had once carried to his door. He placed it on the table and lifted the lid as if he were touching a story for the first time. We looked through the photos together. A Halloween cape made of thrifted velvet. A bike with training wheels that never wanted to obey. A toothless grin that had once made me laugh in the grocery store aisle. Emily watched us and did not interrupt. After a while, she picked up one photo and asked if we could place it near the guest book. Not because it matched an aesthetic, she said, but because it told the truth about him. Andrew did not look away. He nodded. We wrote the ceremony like a letter. No grand statements, no promises no human could keep. They would choose each other again and again, on mornings when the coffee burned and on days when the quiet felt heavy. They would say no to what did not matter so that their yes would have room to breathe. I reached out to a friend who plays the cello with a tenderness that turns rooms into chapels. She said yes without asking what the fee would be. Some work you take because you recognize the shape of the love it serves. The night before the wedding, the air was clear and almost cold. I walked the garden alone with a small flashlight and checked the path where the elderly aunt would need a hand. I placed a basket of blankets where the wind always moved more strongly between 2 trees. I told the caretaker that the caterer would arrive at dawn and that the musicians would need a single outlet near the fountain. I did not bark orders. I offered bearings. It felt like returning to a language I had always spoken, a language I did not have to translate through pride. When morning came, the sky wore that particular blue that only appears when the world is holding its breath for something good. Emily stood in a simple dress that caught the light without devouring it. Andrew waited at the front with his hands at his sides, not trying to hide their trembling. Guests settled into chairs that did not match perfectly and therefore felt like people. The cellist began, and the air grew deeper, as if the day had been tuned. I took my place off to the side, not in the wings of a performance, but in the shade of a tree that had seen more seasons than any of us. Emily walked. Andrew looked. There was no roar from the crowd. There was a quiet that told the truth. When they reached each other, they did not promise perfection. They promised presence. They did not vow to avoid sorrow. They vowed to be the shelter sorrow could not take. As they spoke, I realized that I was no longer waiting for recognition. I had already been invited in the only way that matters. My work was not to be seen. It was to make space for what is real to be seen. When they exchanged rings, a breeze lifted the leaves above us, as if the trees themselves had decided to bear witness. I felt my husband's old words rise inside me like a blessing. For Andrew's day, make it count. We had. The wedding unfolded in the garden like a secret that had been waiting years to be told. The ceremony was not lavish, not extravagant, but it was alive. Chairs stood in imperfect rows, the cello's low voice wrapped the air in warmth, and above us the branches swayed as though nature itself had chosen to witness. Emily walked forward in her simple dress, light glinting in her hair, while Andrew stood trembling, unable to disguise the weight of the moment. They met at the front, not as performers but as people. When they spoke, Their vows were not promises of perfection. They were acknowledgments of imperfection and choices made anyway. They promised to choose each other on mornings when coffee burned and on nights when silence pressed too heavy. They vowed not to escape storms but to shelter within them. As I watched, I realized something profound. I had been holding my breath for so long, waiting for recognition, waiting for apology, waiting to be seen. But recognition was already in the air. My presence was not background. It was foundation. The fact that I was there, trusted, invited, honored, this was the apology I had once thought I needed in words. I did not need the words. I needed this moment. The reception was simple. Long tables set with flowers that looked gathered rather than arranged. Food that was hearty and unpretentious. Music that drifted softly, allowing voices and laughter to rise above it. Guests spoke to one another instead of posing for pictures to prove they had been there. It was not curated. It was lived. I sat back and felt the hum of something I had not touched in years. Peace. Andrew came to me after the plates had been cleared, his suit jacket loosened, his eyes softer than I had seen them in a long time. He wrapped his arms around me, and for a moment he was a boy again. Not a groom, not a man burdened by choices, but my son. "Thank you," he whispered. This was everything. Emily placed her hand on my shoulder then, her eyes wet but bright. "You were the heart of this, Margaret. I cannot imagine this day without you." I nodded. Words would have broken the fragile holiness of that moment. Gratitude does not always need to be spoken twice. Later, as the last guests left and the evening slipped into quiet, I stood at the edge of the garden and watched them dance. Not the flawless performance of rehearsed steps, but the awkward, joyous sway of two people who had chosen each other. The lantern light flickered across their faces, and I felt my lips curve into a smile that came from somewhere deep. I had stayed in my lane, but in doing so I had found a road back to them. Back to love, back to myself. In the weeks that followed, the house did not feel empty. It felt spacious, like air after a storm. Andrew did not call every day, but when he did, it was because he wanted to, not because he felt he owed me something. He spoke of Emily, of her quiet patience, of the way she asked questions that made him think. He told me about his work, about dinners at home, about small routines that felt like a life being built piece by piece. And then one night, as the sun sank into a gold haze outside my kitchen, he said something that rooted itself in me. "Emily told me," he said, his voice steady, "that if she could have had anyone plan her wedding, it would have been you. She thinks what you do is not just about beauty. It is about making people feel something." For a long moment I could not speak. I had not asked for thanks. I had not expected validation. Yet hearing those words from him, from her, was like seeing an old wound close without scar. "I think she is right," I said finally. It was never about perfect flowers or perfect photos. It was about truth. He was quiet for a beat, then whispered, "I am sorry it took me so long to see that." I let the words settle between us like a blanket. I did not need him to say more. He had said enough. Life began to move in rhythms again. I took on a workshop at the community center, teaching young women how to craft weddings on tight budgets without sacrificing meaning. I showed them how to choose candles that cast soft light, how to let fabric breathe instead of suffocating it with pins, how to shape moments that spoke rather than shouted. They listened. They wrote notes. And for the first time in years, I felt not just useful but heard. I began to laugh more. I joined friends for garden tours, walked markets where I did not buy anything but savored the colors, and spent evenings with a book open on my lap and the window cracked to let in the honest chill of night. Healing had not come in a rush. It had arrived like dawn, slow, steady, inevitable. One night Emily stopped by without Andrew. She sat on my porch with a cup of tea, her smile small and genuine. "I just wanted to thank you again," she said, "for everything, for making it real." I looked at her then, really looked, and realized she was not thanking me for flowers or timelines. She was thanking me for presence, for being there without needing control. I smiled back. "You are welcome," I said quietly. As stars blinked awake overhead, I understood something. My journey had never been about being included in someone else's story. It had been about remembering that my story mattered too. Boundaries had once felt like exile. Now they felt like strength. Staying in my lane had not made me invisible. It had made me free. When I closed the door that night, I did not feel loss. I felt enough. Enough love. Enough truth. Enough of myself. And for the first time in years, I knew that was all I had ever needed. There comes a point in life when silence speaks louder than any shouted word. For me, that moment was born the day I was told to stay in my lane. At first, it felt like exile, like being locked out of a future I had waited decades to witness. But in the stillness that followed, I discovered something far more powerful. Staying in my lane was not defeat. It was strength. It was dignity. It was reclaiming the worth that no one else had the right to erase. I had given everything: time, sacrifice, love translated into years of savings. I thought the measure of a mother's value was how much she surrendered. But love that demands silence is not love. It is control. And when control dictates the terms of family, family fractures. That was the lesson I watched unfold. Money vanished. Promises collapsed. The show crumbled. And through it all, I did not rescue. I did not bend. I chose to stand still. And here is what I learned. Sometimes the most radical act is refusing to fight battles you never started. Sometimes peace comes when you stop trying to prove that you belong and simply exist in the truth that you already do. In the end, my silence was not empty. It was loud enough to shatter illusions. It was loud enough to reveal who truly valued me. But this story is not just about loss. It is about return. About finding that even after betrayal and disappointment, love can find its way back when it is rooted in respect. My son returned. A new woman entered his life who saw me, who invited me in, who asked for my presence not out of obligation, but out of genuine honor. Together we built a wedding not of spectacle but of truth. And for the first time, I was not invisible. I was the heart of something real. So if you have ever been told to stay in your lane, let my story remind you of this. Your lane is not a cage. It is a boundary. And boundaries are the road that lead you back to yourself. Do not let anyone convince you that silence means weakness. Sometimes silence is the only weapon strong enough to bring down a lie. This is why stories like mine must be told. Because in a world full of curated images and shallow performances, we need the raw, the painful, the true. And here, on Silent Lies, that is exactly what you will find. Stories that strip away illusions and reveal what happens behind the polished smiles. Stories that remind you that even when love betrays, dignity remains. Subscribe now to Silent Lies, because the quiet truths we uncover here may be the very ones that save you when the world tries to silence your worth.